As noted at the end of section 4, we divided this whole concept of the pivot document into 2 sections. What we have here is the second half of that conversation. We're still talking about U.S. imports and the pivot document, the purchase order. You'll recall from the end of section 4 that we were talking about how all subsequent activities and documentation creation in an inbound supply chain pivots off of the purchase order. We wrap things up in 4 by talking about the various parties that engage in those activities and create those documents. Here, we're going to talk a little bit about what those documents are. First bullet, documents in an import supply chain that are born of or impacted by the purchase order include the commercial invoice. That's the commercial invoice that the supplier, the vendor overseas, creates after they produce goods and are ready to ship. Of course, that commercial invoice has to be a reflection of the purchase order. That's what started the whole transaction. Same for the packing list, which comes from the vendor as well. If an insurance certificate is required, it has to be a reflection of the quantities originally articulated in the PO. Something we've talked about a couple of times now and we'll see in much greater detail in modules 6 and 7, the forwarder's cargo receipt. The unsung hero of documentation in an import model, the FCR. When goods are sent to a freight forwarder, physically sent to a freight forwarder, not containerized, but physically received by a forwarder, they're going to issue a receipt. One can easily conceptualize the importance of the consistency that must exist between original purchase orders and maybe POs that were even changed after the fact, and the forwarder's cargo receipt that is generated upon physical acceptance of the goods by a forwarder from a vendor. Same goes for the advanced ship notice, the ASN, which is sent from origin on a per shipment or perhaps per container basis, articulating all the details with an ocean shipment. If we can't tie ASNs into purchase orders, we have a big problem from a visibility perspective. What does that even mean? Because if we can't identify what's in an ocean container through an ASN on both a purchase order and item-specific level, the visibility that we spoke of previously in this module is going to be non-existent. Trade tip, we mentioned this briefly. Let's say it again explicitly. If there are changes to a PO after its original issuance, which oftentimes there are, these subsequent documents must reflect that change. If a PO is issued in March and the delivery isn't due until June, lots can go on with a purchase order. Forecasts change, demand signals change, purchase orders are canceled, quantities are increased on a PO, quantities are decreased on a PO. We have to have the most recent version of the purchase order and be able to reflect the most recent version in these subsequent documents. If they don't match, that's a whole other problem. We'll talk about that later. Other documents in an import supply chain that are born of or impacted by the PO, the transport doc, the ocean bill of lading, airway bill, truck or intermodal bill of lading for cross-border shipments, that's what we're talking about there. The transport document lists, at least in number of pieces or number of pallets, what's in the shipment. What's in the shipment, to a very great extent, is impacted by the final version of the purchase order. Importer security filing 10+2, that's a maritime supply chain security federal law put in place by the United States. We talked about this before. We'll see it again. But from a security perspective, it would be helpful to know what's in an ocean container. How do we determine, in part, what's in an ocean container? By what's reflected in the POs that are in that ocean container. Trade tip. Even if there are changes to a PO, when a U.S. customs entry is submitted, it is the, and we quote, price paid or payable at the time of export that CBP recognizes as the entered value for the payment of duty. What does this mean? That POs are going to change. We already explained why. If POs change, other documents change. Commercial invoice, packing list, bill of lading. The information on those documents is what is used to do a customs entry. We can't have confusion between what an original PO said and an updated PO said and what's on the commercial docs. Commercial invoice, packing list, etc. That creates a whole other scenario from a customs perspective. But let's say here, and we'll get into this topic much more deeply in our compliance module, when an entry is done, it's the price paid or payable at the time of export from the country of origin. Okay, supply chain perspective, what we like to call the 3 C's of documentation. Let's jump right in. As stated previously, the purchase order really does serve as the import supply chain's pivot document. in that almost all subsequent documents that support the flow of goods are born of the PO's content. From the time a vendor prepares a commercial invoice until a customs entry is prepared in the U.S., the vast majority of content in those documents is born of a PO. We've explained that, we've emphasized it, it must be accepted as supply chain gospel. Second paragraph. Given this sequential dependence on the contents of a PO, it is essential that importers and their supply chain partners observe what can be called the 3 C's of documentation: complete, consistent, and correct. What does that mean? Complete refers to the need for all required documents to be present to accompany a transaction. In the U.S., to do an entry, you either need the documents or the content of the documents found on a commercial invoice, a packing list, and the transport doc to even do the entry. They have to be there, or the information at least has to be there. Consistent means that all information across documents is the same. We can't have a different address for the importer of record in the U.S. on the commercial invoice versus the transport document. We can't show a packing list with 1,000 pieces and then the transport document says 10 pallets. Now, it might be 10 pallets that contain 1,000 pieces. That's a different conversation. The information has to be consistent. And correct is just that. The information on the documents is accurate. Piece count, country of origin, bill of lading number, weight, all of those things have to be correct. Without observing this best practice, it is very likely that actual shipments will get slowed down and in some cases stopped completely, most likely in customs at origin and or destination. As such, the PO serves as the pivot document upon which the 3 C's of documentation must be based. One last proviso. Make sure that the purchase order upon which all of these other documents and activities are born is the most recent version of the PO. Moving forward, mentioned previously, the documents that support import transactions are created by multiple parties. We said that. Let's summarize. The vendor, the supplier, the forwarder, the customs broker, the bank, cargo insurance company, etc. They need to be on board with this whole idea of the 3 C's of documentation. As such, second bullet, all parties, including internal departments of the U.S. importer, must be working off the most recent information, singing off the same sheet of music, as we like to say here in the U.S. All of that starts with the most recent version of the PO. A PO can change. It can be canceled. It can be increased. It can be decreased. A whole other new PO can be issued. These are the responses that we see on the buy side of the supply chain to changes in the forecast and actual demand signals. We're tying that concept back in as we have done so often. As a quick note, the following slide, which wraps up this section, calls out both the impacted parties and internal departments as POs are generated and activities unfold. A nice visual portrayal of what we're talking about. To reiterate our title, the purchasing function, impacted parties, and internal departments. On the top, in the upper left-hand side, we see impacted parties from top to bottom. The supplier, the actual vendor, but internal parties like sourcing, like supply chain, the actual importer, product inspection, the sales department, the finance department that we tied in so much earlier in this module. Of course, the origin freight forwarder that plays such a huge role in all of these activities, and the logistics department of our own organization. These are the impacted parties, both internally and externally. The two external parties that are most impacted are the supplier and the freight forwarder. If we move from left to right, we see actual activities. A quote received from an overseas vendor. Terms are negotiated. Purchase orders are issued. Suppliers have to set up. Orders are accepted. Purchase orders are accepted by vendors. Production is started. Some samples come off the line. Initial inspections are done. A hot product inspection might take place. E-bookings are made by the vendor, booking for cargo space on a ship or aircraft. E-commercial docs are sent by the vendor. Goods sailed. Goods arrive. They go through customs and are received. These are the various activities. What should be obvious is that when there's a check mark in the cell where activities and players intersect, that's who's impacted and or responsible for that activity. Just on a high level, you can see a lot of check marks here. A lot of activities and many internal and external parties involved. Goodness knows how many check marks there are. Dozens? This is a visual representation of the interdependencies that exist across parties and activities. Let's pick one. The supplier. We already said that they're probably the biggest player as an external party in this whole drill. The supplier is going to quote the U.S. importer. There's going to be some negotiation that takes place. The U.S. importer is going to send a purchase order. That PO has to be accepted, formally accepted, hopefully electronically. Production is going to begin. Let's move through that process quickly to the right. Goods are ready to go. The vendor has to make a booking. How does that happen? Sometimes with a simple phone call or not so simple phone call to a forwarder at origin to request a booking. Just like in the old days when someone would call a hotel and make a reservation. It's the same thing, metaphorically, making a booking for space on a ship. These days, it's mostly done electronically. We see upwards of 10 check marks just on the supplier. Let's look at the buyer as another example. That quotation process, the placement of a PO process, having visibility, although the buyer isn't doing the production, having visibility into the production. If the buyer requires an initial inspection, a couple of pieces come off of a line that need to be inspected, clearly the buyer is involved in that, as is a third-party inspection company. Any samples that need to be sent, hot production requests, and of course the buyer wants to know, or at least have access to information that tells them that not only are goods ready to go from the vendor, but that a booking has been made. Because from a transportation perspective, nothing really happens until a reservation, a booking, is made. The U.S. importer needs visibility into that, and digital tools that are out there today in the market provide that visibility. We need to know inbound timing, and of course, arrival at destination, LA Long Beach Port being the most prominent example we've used, but the buyer needs that information to plan what they're going to do with the goods and how they're going to get them out into the sell side of the distribution network of the overall supply chain. We can go on and on here. In fact, let's have a look at the origin forwarder. Interesting to note, we don't see a lot of check marks in the first cells because a lot of that is between the importer and the supplier. Sure, the forwarder can get involved in some of these things, but the forwarder creates value when the goods are ready to move. That's why we see the check marks on the e-booking, e-commercial documents sent. You might ask, well, what does the forwarder care about the documentation? They can't do anything without the documentation. Goods at origin can't clear export customs without at least the information on the documents. It's pretty hard to do a transport doc if you don't know what's going to be in the container, which is listed on a packing list. The bottom line is the forwarder needs the commercial docs, hopefully provided in an electronic format. Of course, the forwarder organizes the actual sailing with the steamship line, provides hopefully tracking capabilities online, and can also organize destination and customs clearance activities. As we said, we could spend hours on this one slide. We've given some decent examples, who the players are, what the activities are, and how the purchase order in many instances serves as the pivot document. Lots of players, lots going on, lots of check marks. We'll be delving into many of them in detail as this entire training program unfolds. That's the end of this section. When we come back, we'll get into purchasing agreements and purchase orders.